Beloved and friends, we are in our last session, session 7 on Christ and culture. And I trust you have a handout. If you would, please open that with me and look at our second page. There has been a lot considered in this series, and I do not intend to rehearse or even review what we've covered. Let me just kind of give a brief overarching trace of where we've been, but not reviewing details. We started with the explanation of what woke means, and it's an overarching umbrella to describe a cultural movement that is happening right now all around us, and that movement has been presented in various titles: social justice, it's been described as critical race theory. Certainly there's a whole sexual revolution taking place, gender ideology. There's all these things that are coming at us. All of them are related to this one umbrella concept of being woke, awakened to a systemic problem in our culture. That idea of being awakened to a systemic problem, a problem with the system, is from cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism was our second lesson, and that really was describing the worldview behind what we're seeing in the culture today. We then moved into specifically social justice, the critical social justice movement, and described its outworkings. We then looked at critical race theory. We moved into the concept of cultural sexuality, and then cultural communication. And tonight we close with understanding the church and culture. We've considered Christ and culture. We've considered how Christ, of course, is our all. And he is who we want to present to the culture. This session focuses more practically on how. How are we to do that? Look with me at the top of page 2. Just a reminder to us in a sort of a pithy staccato fashion. Our land is vexed, the church is confused, the reasons are many, and the solution is singular. We need to have this as really what leads us tonight. I want two sections I want to cover tonight in principle in two major headings. First is going to be reclaiming the church, and then reaching the culture. Reclaiming the church. Let's start there. Right at the top, our aim is to reclaim the church in the culture, not the culture. Our prayer is that through the church, gospel revival would impact the culture for Christ. It's important for us to calibrate that rightly and put it in the right order. I pray that you see the importance of that. We are not advocating using Christianity as our excuse to really try to reclaim our culture. We are genuinely faced with the reality that we are Christians before anything else. We are citizens of heaven before America. And we are first and foremost slaves of Christ. And we are his ambassadors. And the most important reality that we could do right now is to promote Christ in this culture. Have we missed something? Has the church missed something? What is meant by reclaim? Must the church do something different? Are we, as Christ's church, responsible before God to make a difference in the culture? Is the change of our culture part of our charter and commission? I'm intending to be a bit provocative and challenge us to think in categories we perhaps aren't always accustomed to or aren't so clear in. I do say yes and no. Yes and no. Let me explain. Yes, we are in danger of missing something. Yes, the church at large in America today has come to a place where she should not be because of things she has not done well. So yes, there is some change that is needed. So there is a yes to this. And as far as the culture is concerned, if the church is healthy and vibrant, then it should be impacting culture, Just as a lighthouse, if it is operating according to design and is healthy and vibrant, it will illumine the darkness. It doesn't change the water or change the cliffs, but it does light upon them. So there is a yes, a qualified yes, because there's also a no. And what do I mean? And I want you to catch this. The church is not responsible for the culture. The church is not the culture's keeper. We don't manage the culture. And it's not our charter to change it. So there's a very strong no that it's not the church's responsibility. It's not our commission. Let's look at the bottom of page 2. Is the church the culture's keeper? Let's just walk through this logically. Culture is comprised of people. Culture merely reflects, A, and B, in turn directs. So it does have a perpetuating effect. But it merely reflects first. It reflects and in turn directs people. But people make culture, and people need Christ. The church alone proclaims Christ. People, then, are the pursuit of the church's commission, not the culture. As Spurgeon said, to attempt national regeneration without personal regeneration is to dream of erecting a house without separate bricks. You cannot change the culture in and of itself. The commission of the church is to pursue people. When people change, cultures change. Make sense? It is a beautiful reality, and for us to remember the transition just briefly, theologically. Old Covenant was a nation. God had established a nation with its own constitution. It was a theocracy that God had defined and was unique among all the nations of the world. And this is the Old Covenant principle, that God would have this nation bearing witness to his glory. And the principal way that nation would glorify God is by faithfulness to the stewards of his word, and most importantly, the steward of the lineage that would bring forth the incarnate word. Israel was chosen among all the nations to be this agency wherein they were entrusted with the oracles of God and entrusted with the lineage of God's promise to bring the Christ. And in the fullness of time, the Christ came. And his commission to his people is not the same as Israel. His commission to his people is not to go out and establish nations or a nation or to change nations. The commission to his people is to go speak to every living creature. The focus moves from the nation to the individual. It moves from the national to the heart of the person. So, look on page 3 at the top. The church is the embassy of Christ. The church is not a nation in any physical sense, in any material sense, in any ethnic or, again, global economic sense. The church is an embassy, a spiritual embassy in a foreign land. Look at this next paragraph. The church is Christ's embassy stationed within the culture. The embassy of the kingdom of God stationed in a foreign land. We're the embassy of the kingdom of God, and we are stationed in a foreign land. So we fly our flag of the kingdom, and we live in a foreign land. Now think about that picture. When I traveled in science, I remember seeing embassies, and there was always comforting in a foreign country like Germany or France when I would go by and see the American embassy. Oh, it just reminded me of home. And it was always comforting just to see it. because everything else was so foreign to me and a bit insecure. Well, this is the idea. We are the embassy of the kingdom of God. The citizens of the kingdom, delight to see the embassy wherever she is stationed in this foreign land. Now, notice this next point, this middle of this paragraph. She, that is the embassy, that is the church, has no more responsibility to change the culture than a foreign embassy has to change the nation in which she is stationed. Right? No, nobody anywhere thinks that it's the responsibility of the embassy, the American embassy in Paris, to change France. No. It's an outpost. And that's what we are. Our embassy, the embassy of Christ's church, is to proclaim the message of his kingdom. It is to reach this world, but this is not his kingdom. In John chapter 17, the night that Christ was betrayed, he prayed to the Father, and he prayed that we as his people would be one. And he said, Father, I don't ask that you take them out of the world. I don't ask that you take them out of the foreign country. I ask that you keep them there, that they would be in but not of that foreign land. And then in chapter 18, it's no coincidence that chapter 18, Pontius Pilate is talking to him. Are you a king then? And the words of our Lord says, my kingdom is not of this foreign land. It's not of this world. The whole point and the thrust of all is when he gives the Great Commission after his crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection, and his commissioning of his disciples is to go into all the world, go to all the nations, speak to every living creature, and tell them about me. That's our commission. Not to change culture. So, this also, I am burdened to say, is a matter of wisdom and discernment. And what do I mean by this? It's cutting both ways. We live in a foreign land that's dangerous to the embassy. Not only physically, but even spiritually. So understand with me, Hebrews 5:14, solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained. That takes discipline of the mind. To train the powers of discernment by constant practice, there's the discipline, to distinguish, it's not a physical thing, it's a mental, spiritual reality, to distinguish good from evil. This is part of our responsibility while we are in a foreign land. We are to be wise and discerning. I like this quote, cultural engagement without cultural wisdom leads to cultural captivity. If we are to in some way reach this culture for Christ, then it takes great wisdom, because in the process we are vulnerable to have the culture influence us more than we influence it. Does that make sense? There's the concern right here. Vodi Bakum says that it is a catastrophe that is unavoidable, this whole business of the woke movement. He says these fault lines are so deeply entrenched and the rules of engagement so perilously complex that the question is not if, but when the catastrophe will strike. In fact, the ground is already shaking. The relationships are being ruined. Reputations are being tarnished. Careers are being destroyed. And entire denominations are in danger of being derailed. I don't think he overstates the case. Jared Longshore says plainly that God is handing America over to her sins. But I'm not content to think that the Church of Christ in America, perhaps the greatest source of missionary support in this world for the gospel, perhaps one of the last strongholds of conservative Christianity, I'm not content to say we just throw our hands up and pretend that we have no place here, and pretend that we have no responsibility here, and pretend that there's nothing for us to do here. That we just say, well, the catastrophe is unavoidable, let it come. No. We are vulnerable in the process, and this I just want to tease out a little bit more. I want to remind us, we're going to get to how we respond, but I do want to remind us of our vulnerability, that we're not immune to this. And please catch this. These are brief little statements. This whole chapter, just a footnote, this whole chapter is really a compilation of brief little things. It's long, but it's a compilation. I intend to grow this when I massage it out and include more detail later. But for now, summary. Okay, back to the point. In top of page 4, please listen carefully to this. This is just a burden on my heart. In Revelation, the book of Revelation, Christ visited several different local churches and held local churches, each one of them, responsible for its own values and choices. Each local church is responsible for what it believes and loves and how it lives. That means we are. We need to be careful when we start thinking about and we use the term and throw it around the church, the church, the church. You see, I'm systematically trying to address how does the church relate to the culture, but right here, I want to drill down to specifically how does this church? Because Christ will hold every local church responsible. Right? 7 churches in Revelation. And he calls them all out and says, you this and you that and you this. He doesn't just say, oh, the church. So let us not do that. Let us take this. I think there's a danger in thinking these things are just out there. In thinking when we say the church and the church's responsibility, that someone else will do that. Or that church, or whatever. I don't know what we think. Sometimes I don't think we think. We need to think about this. What do we mean when we say the church and what she should be doing? What did it mean when Paul's talking in Philippians 2 about the church? Who was that? It was a smaller church than this, by the way. Oh, it's amazing. Look at this next paragraph. Christ will build his church and it will not fail, but local churches can fail. Right? They are vulnerable, not immune to the dangers all about them. Christ has called us to be responsible as miniature models of his bride in our devotion, decisions, and deeds. A local church can fail like Samson, who did not know that the Lord had left him. Do you remember that? Samson was duped. And his strength left him because, well, he got sucked into this whole business of the outside influence, appealing to his own fleshly desires. And the tragic statement of Samson was, he didn't know if the Lord left him. And what did it render him? Powerless in his circumstance. I dare say there are many churches that are in danger of being powerless in the face of the cultural circumstance for a similar reason. And our responsibility is not to try to point out other churches and compare. Our responsibility is to say, is it I, Lord? Is it I? Let's remember this as we move on. This is not our home, and again, Danny very nicely brought my heart to worship there in reminding us of that and then us singing about that. And just think about this. Hebrews 11:13. These all died, all those who came before us who are models of faith, these all died, not having received the things promised. That's the mark of faith. They live and they walk not according to what they see or receive in this foreign land, but according to the sure promise of what they will receive in the land to come, their homeland. So having not received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. That's the mark of faith. We're vulnerable, and the key to being vulnerable, to enduring that, is faith. Our faith. Let's just read through this quickly. This world is all that this world has. It is to be expected that those who have no other hope would clamor about this broken world, insisting change. Clamoring in this earth for what is only possible in the new earth is existential futility. People want paradise. We were made for it. But here's the problem. Paradise is not man-made. It will never be. Impose all the laws you want or take them all away, evil remains. Sin will persist and perpetrate evil against others. This world is under a curse because of our rebellion against God. Until humanity learns to grope for God in repentance, we have failed the lesson of this life. While we must be good stewards of God's varied graces in this life, we are finally sojourners and exiles in a foreign land. This is not our home. Justice will never be perfect in this place. People will always get away with crimes in this life. Many evils go unpunished, but as Christians, we know and trust that there will be a day of justice. God will execute perfect justice in that great and terrible day. This is not the age of justice. Refuse to allow this world and its needs to eclipse the next. This affords no license to irresponsibility or neglect. Rather, it is a call to priorities, radical focus. Let's remember this idea of victimhood, and I had a lot more to say, but I'm just going to summarize it this way. Fundamentally, we are not victims in our world. We are all criminals in God's world. Right? We are not victims in our world. We are criminals in God's world. I love what Charles Spurgeon says here. I just find it striking. You know, Karl Marx came out with his ideology while our beloved, at least he is to me very dearly, my best friend in that room through books, is Pastor Charles Spurgeon. And in his day, he was preaching in London when Karl Marx was constructing his communism. And listen to what Spurgeon said about the ideology of Marx. This was specifically about Marxism. He says, in the early days of Christianity, multitudes of Christians were tormented to death because of their faith in Jesus. There was no excuse for it, for they had done no harm to the state. Christianity does not come into a nation to break up its arrangements or to break down its fabric. His point is he's giving a little comparison jab to socialism and saying that this ideology seeks to come into nations and break down their fabrics. That's their gospel, so-called. Christianity isn't like that. Watch what he goes on to say. It snaps no ties of the family, which is what Marxism does. It dislocates no bonds of the body politic, which is what Marxism does. There are theories of socialism, there it is, and the like, which lead to anarchy and riot, 2020. But it is not so with the mild and gentle teaching of Jesus Christ, whose every word is love and patience. Amen and amen. I'll leave this for you to read later. Despise all racism, despise all injustice, and discipline the mind. I have a whole series on it, so I didn't put it here. So we can go on to the next page, 7. In the discipline of the mind thought, I just want to remind us the connection that Paul makes. He makes specifically the point, beloved and friends, remember that this is much more spiritual than it is cultural. It's a spiritual war. And in the context of Paul talking about the spiritual war, it's in that context he talks about the discipline of the mind. Therefore, we take every thought captive to obey Christ, because our weapons of warfare are not fleshly. That's the nature of what we're dealing with. So with that in mind, let's remember, as I tried to present right there in short, reclaiming the church. Reclaiming the church. Let's think now about reaching the culture. First and foremost, I would say the first responsibility we have, the first necessity we have, is to fear God and not the world. We are to fear God and nothing else. When the church fears other things, the church will fail to be the witness she's designed and empowered and commissioned to be. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of our wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of the church's knowledge. That's Proverbs 9:10 in principle. The fear of the Lord is truly the beginning of our holiness even. It is the fear of the Lord that will be the foundation of our power. The fear of the Lord will be the foundation of our witness. The fear of the Lord will be the foundation of our strength. The fear of the Lord is the most important and necessary element that is missing in the church's effort to reach the culture. We don't fear the Lord. And if I could just remind us briefly, every testimony in the Old Covenant, every testimony in the Old Testament reminds us over and over and over, every time the people lost the fear of the Lord, there was just ruin and destruction, apostasy and idolatry. That's all it was. The people of God were completely zapped of any sort of witnessing power. Even the nation itself, when there was no fear of God in their eyes, every man did what was right in his own eyes. And when it talks about in the Psalms about the fool who? The fool, maybe the fool in Israel, because there's no fear of God in his eyes. Paul quotes that later in Romans chapter 3. The fear of God is the first and most important element we need to reach the culture. We need to bear witness that there is one God, triune in person, holy, majestic, powerful, just, righteous. And he is a wrathful God, and he will wreak vengeance upon all who offend. He's also gracious and merciful and loving and kind and patient. And he has made a way for every rebel to be saved. And he calls them gently. Repent, repent, for this awesome God does not delight in the death of the wicked, but that all would repent and come to the saving knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. We need the fear of the Lord to communicate that. Let's start here then. After the fear of the Lord, what do we need? I think this. We need to confront ourselves, corporately and individually. As a church, like one of the churches in Revelation, we need to examine ourselves, right? Because Christ did that. He came to the church and he talked about the plurality in that church as one. You, church in Sardis, what do you have to do? You need to repent. You do, as a church. So there's a corporate aspect. There's also an individual aspect. And I just want us to remember how, again, Peter warned even, for it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. That's where our critique should be first. We shouldn't be quick to point out all the failures of everywhere else, especially the world. They don't even have the Spirit. We should be quick to look in the mirror before we dare to go speak to them. And humble ourselves before a holy God and remind ourselves, like we sang, let us all go, not with arrogance and pomp and with Bible bats in our hands, but with a bleeding heart, tears in our eyes, compassion, and deep, deep humility. We need to confront ourselves first. If the church is to be light to this world, she must first tend to the light within. The best way to promote Christ in the world is by promoting Christ right here. This is part of the no in the question, does the church need to do something different? No. Because the most important thing that we must do is the most important thing we must always do. It's independent of the culture. And that is, we are to make much of Christ in everything. If we do that thoroughly, genuinely, authentically, we wouldn't be where we are in the church at large in America. We would maintain a bold witness in the fear of God, of the glorious grace of Christ. And we would love him more than being loved by the world. Isn't that where we need to be? To love him more than being loved by the world? But the church has stumbled in this area many times. Let's consider 3 subpoints on this confronting ourselves. We need to confront ourselves in our identity. Christ's precious bride. That's who we are. We are the bride of Christ. Even this church as a model of Christ's bride. Don't think of the local church as like a limb on the universal church. Or don't think of the local church as somehow only, part of the universal church. Think of the local church as a miniature model of the bride of Christ. You are the bride. And he loves you. He loves you so much that he gave himself for you, that you might be sanctified by him, having been cleansed by him, by the washing of water with the word, so that Christ might present you to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that you might be holy and without blemish. That is wonderful. Let's start there when we confront ourselves, when we look in the mirror, when we think about who we are as a church and how we relate to the culture. We must first remember who we are in Christ. We are the bride of Christ. We are the only ones who have the Holy Spirit in this whole world. Only Christians have him. We are the only ones who have the cure to the fall and death and sin and the curse. We're the only ones who hold out hope and light to this world. We need to remember who we are. We are loved by God. We are loved by Christ. We are secure in that love. Let's move into how that affects us individually. Let me just summarize this paragraph. Don't let anyone else define you but Christ. Don't let the culture define you. Don't let colors of hair or skin or eyes or size of body or shape. Don't let anything else define you. Don't let your gender define you. Don't let your abilities define you. Let Christ define you. And when Christ defines you, your heart's affections and appetites will conform to him. And when that happens, one by one in the church, in the local church becomes more and more beautiful, sanctified, washed. Secondly, when we confront ourselves, we need to think of deep humility. We need to identify failures and weaknesses within. Start with our identity, lest this would crush us. We are in Christ. We are secure in Christ. But let us not pretend that we have weaknesses and we have failures. And we ought not to judge any before we take the plank out of our own eye. It has well been said, the paragraph there under the scripture, it has well been said, truth without humility is judgmentalism. Humility without truth is cowardice. Some have legitimate criticisms against the church, against the way that Christians have treated them within the church and the way that Christians have talked about and neglected people outside the church. Some have even been hurt in the church. Now, please understand what I'm saying is there are some who are writing these books who are promoting a wokeism, a wokeness, and their progressive Christianity, the excuse they give is exactly this. They point to the weaknesses and the failures of churches they've attended. And they justify the promotion of things like CRT, the promotions of things like social justice, the promotion of the whole sexual autonomy and cultural sexuality. They promote those things by the excuse that the church has failed them. Now, my next sentence here is important. This doesn't excuse them for their choices, but neither does their responsibility excuse ours. In other words, just because people make certain choices that they're accountable for and that prove their own hearts, it doesn't excuse us for self-examination. It doesn't give us license to just overlook it. It is not allowable for us. There is no excuse for us to not take every opportunity to consider there might be a thread of truth in their criticism, and that we need to examine our own hearts. Lutzer touches on this, and he describes how it affects and, again, relates to progressive Christianity. You can read that later. I would invite you on page 9 to ask those questions of yourself, each one of us here in Christ Church. What legitimate criticisms have been made against theologically conservative churches in the areas of this subject matter? I can tell you right now, one of them is going to be, all of them, racism. Racism is a reality, a terrible, wicked reality that exists in the hearts of people and has been found in many churches. In injustice, Christians treating other Christians and non-Christians in unjust ways, not being equitable and not being fair, not being right, even on social matters and business matters. There's been discrimination just because of the way a person looks or the crowd they come from or the habits they've been enslaved to for so many years. We are not a clean people. Let us not be judgmental when someone walks in the door that looks different than us. These are legitimate criticisms that we all need to be humbled by. How can you personally help contribute to addressing and correcting these weaknesses or failures? Think about that, please, lest this be just an exercise in futility. How could we personally work on being kinder to people, greeting people, being more just in our dealings with the world, walking with greater integrity in the way we manage our resources, finances, in the way we obey laws, how we treat people who are of different ethnicities or backgrounds or different temptations sexually? Often the Bible or traditional Christianity is criticized because of the failings of some representatives or some who represent. Now, how is that a fallacy? What I'm after there, I didn't write that very well, so let me explain. What I'm after there is, I want to now flip the coin and say, we need to be careful not to just allow my previous exhortation to somehow place us in the position where we think that all criticism is legitimate, that there's a ground for all this, that anything said that can actually go beyond our conduct and really the criticism of discrepancy between what the Scripture teaches and what we live, and begin to criticize the Scripture. So there's the line you've got to draw. Here's my point. Everyone's a hypocrite to some degree, because even the world doesn't live up to its own standards. The key then becomes, is it legitimate to measure Christianity, to measure Christ, to measure Scripture by the conduct of its adherents? Well, to some degree. But here's the argument I want to encourage you to think through. It cannot ultimately be the standard. Ultimately, the Scripture itself, Christ himself, we must remind and engage the culture to remind them, no. You don't know him. We're all fallen, we're all broken, we're all still sinners. Please come, let me show you Christ. He's the one that you need to look at to measure the claims. And then on the flip side of that, when you engage the culture, you also, both positively and negatively, can't simply look at the conduct of the people and assume and measure their ideology. This is why. Because some people, in fact, most people, I would dare to say, most people following this ideology are actually going to be more virtuous than the ideology calls for. Most people you encounter who are bought into this are going to be fairly nice people, many of them in churches. And they're going to live far above really Marxism. They're going to live above it. They're going to have Jesus too, in addition to this. And you can't judge the system on that. You got to call them to see, no. You're not living consistent with this. This calls for an anti-Christian agenda. You got to see that, beloved friend, right? And then on the negative side also, you've got to understand that sometimes we judge people based on their conduct and we don't realize that is not an accurate measure of the ideas behind their living. So always, this is the last part on this, always we need to go to the ideology. We need to go to what is the worldview. We need to understand what is the teaching. And we need to, when we engage the culture, how the church relates to the culture, we need to call people to see, okay, I understand you're living that way, or you're thinking this way, or you're doing this, but you need to understand, where does this system of thought come from, and where does it ultimately go? So the critical point is getting underneath the surface to the ideology. Make sense? Okay. Finally, in the confrontation of self as church, we start with our identity, we look at our humility, or look to humility, and then we look to responsibility. Focus on Christ in the church. There's our charter. The key, even in the apologetics context that Peter gives, is honor Christ in your heart. And they'll ask you, oh, what a compelling picture, that you would so honor Christ, that the culture would ask you, what is this hope you have? You are a very hopeful person. I can't believe how you live with joy in the midst of darkness and pain. Where do you get that? How can you live as though your future is bright? How? Oh, I pray that more people would ask us that question because they would see it in us. So how do we do that? Well, let me just summarize it this way. Again, may the church focus all the more in this time on making much of Christ. On making much of Christ in all of our gatherings, in our homes, in our marriages, in our parenting, in making much of Christ in our private lives, in the workplace, in school, in making much of Christ in our plans and investments, in our futures, in making much of Christ in the face of tragedy and pain and loss and sorrow, making much of Christ in all the tumultuous change of the culture, that we would stand forward with light in a crooked and twisted generation. That's how we make much of Christ and treasure him and value him and cling to him and adore him and praise him and fear him and honor him and obey him in the midst of everything else that's shifting sand. That's how we need to confront ourselves. Well, this next point on the next page 10, contribute change, not complaint. I think you can get that. You can read it later. That's also in the Philippians context we read. Isn't it striking that he talks about God is in you to work and to will for his own good pleasure? And then right after that, so don't grumble, don't complain. You're in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. You're in the midst of a foreign land that does not understand these things. In fact, they will persecute you, and this is a sign because it's been granted to you. It's been given to you. It's a gift. God gave you a big gift. And on one side it says faith, on the other side it says suffering. Not only to believe in his name, but to suffer for his sake. It's given to you to suffer in this crooked and twisted generation. So hold out the light when you suffer. So don't complain. Here's what I'm after. I'm moving. You might be able to see my logic here. We're moving now from the self-examination, fear God, self-examination. Now we're moving out to reach the culture. How do we move out? We start with fearing God, we examine self, and then we move out. How do we move out? We move out by thinking, okay, look, we've got a lot of complaints in every heart in this room. Every one of you can give me a list of complaints about our culture. God does not call us to sit and complain. He calls us to hold out light. We are not to contribute to the litany of complaining in this world. Everybody complains. We are not to be complainers. We are to be those people who have hope and say, yeah, there's a lot to complain about, but let me tell you about this Jesus. He's my all. And you hold out the light. So that's how we reach culture. We start reaching by the joy within, by the love that is within glowing, that changes everything for us. So we're not given instinctively just to complain because we're focused in the right place. We're focused on Christ. And in this way, then, we are to be responsible, not reactional. And you can read that later as well. And the next page, 11. And then I've already mentioned how it's more spiritual than cultural. And just remind us that it is a spiritual warfare. On the next page, 12, the call to be strong and courageous. Just a couple of notes on that. Why Bauckham wrote his book, he called it out the same way. I point to the example of Israel in its physical dimension, that if they were called to be strong and courageous in a physical way, how much more? Because spiritual realities demand more courage. How much more are we to be strong and courageous? And our commission isn't to go take over a chunk of dirt. Our commission is to go into all the world. Joshua was saying, be strong and courageous right now. Why? Because you got to take this little chunk of dirt that God's given so that the Christ can be born there. So go get that. So be strong and courageous, guys. That little chunk of dirt can fit into California 14 times. That's how small it is in the global economy of things. It's tiny. And we are told to go into all the earth. Listen. We need to be strong and courageous. All right. Now, I must bring us to a close, but I wanted to introduce you to at least these two concepts before. So, in The Art of War, written centuries and centuries ago, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Page 14. I want to just mention strategies and tactics, just to whet your appetite for the workbook that's coming, because we're not going to cover it all. So strategies, the distinctive point about a strategy is that the strategy is concerned with the goal and the plans to get there. The tactic, however, is specific to the actual movements. the actual methods. So I do think that those are the two ways that we need to think about reaching the culture. We need to first have the strategy, and then we need to understand tactics. What are our movements in a point-by-point, person-by-person, one-on-one kind of encounter? How do I do this to serve the strategy, the aim and goal? Well, I give you 3 broad strokes for the strategy. These 3 broad strokes, they rule my life. And that's not why I'm giving them to you. I say they rule my life for the same reason I'm giving them to you. I believe they absolutely dominate and establish the paradigm of Christian pursuit in the church and the church's mission. And it's this. Number 1, bless God. Number 2, bless the church. Number 3, bless the world. You could say it this way: to exalt God, to edify and equip and encourage the church, and to evangelize the lost. It's always in this order. We are redeemed to make much of God. We are redeemed to be worshipers. As worshipers, we're a family. And in the example of 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, if a man doesn't provide for his own family, he's worse than an unbeliever. The point? The church is to take care of the church before it looks to the world for anything or to serve anything. If the church doesn't take care of the church, it's worse than an unbeliever. So first, glory to God. Second, serving the church, protecting her, loving her, caring for her, blessing her. And then third, in all her might, seeking to serve by blessing this world. And I give you some quotes there mainly from Strawn to help fortify some of these points. Consider now, then I do this A-B thing, okay? So there's the 3 points: God, church, world, in that order. And then I think it's important to consider these 1, 2, because they really deal with the God, church part, how we reach the world. It's the exercise of these 2 working into the third. A and B, A and B. A would be, start with this: trust God. In all things, no matter, come what may, there was a Latin phrase, come what may, the Christians would walk and declare, come what may, throw me to the lions, come what may, they will be faithful and resolved to honor God, to glorify God, to make much of Christ, come what may. So don't fear, beloved. Don't fear all the cultural chaos. Don't fear. A message to the church: worship the Lord your God and don't fear. And then trusting him, you don't fear. And then B, proclaim the gospel. That's a summary of all of it. In fact, if you get nothing else out of this message, just get those 2. Trust God, proclaim the gospel. That's the church's commission. That's the main thing we are to do. Proclaim the gospel. Christ's means for bringing about change in this cursed world is the gospel. That's the means. The church has no other commission, no other power, no other arraignment or armament, no other message, no other hope. The church is not commissioned for cultural or political battles. The church is commissioned to proclaim Christ. Only Christ can create real change for good. He alone is the true light of the world, and his light alone conquers the darkness. So we've gone through a series on the culture. We've learned a lot about what the culture's thinking and believing and what they're doing. But in the end, we come and find out, here we are, the church. And what are we to do about it? The same thing. We are to trust God and proclaim the gospel. Come what may, right? That's what we are to do. And there's just some thoughts there I jotted down about some of that. Okay. Oh, very good. Okay, then I got another A and B. Commit to prayer, and B, commit to action. Trust God, proclaim the gospel. Commit to prayer, commit to action. You can see how these relate. And then again, on page 19, live by truth, A, and B, live in love. Live by truth reminds us of the sufficiency of Scripture, the sufficiency of the Bible you have in your hand. What do you need to be effective and to be genuine and to be a witness in this world to this culture for Christ? Truly, at the end of the day, this is sufficient. Doesn't mean that God says it's the only thing you should ever look to as though it's exhaustive. No, it's sufficient. Every principle necessary for the powerful working of the Spirit to make change in this world is sufficiently in your hand. So you don't need to worry about which book do I need. You got it. You got it. Be in it. Live by truth. Live by truth. And then live in love. Look at this little sentence. Love beckons gentleness. Let us not assume that everyone buying into wokeness is at the same level of understanding and commitment. We must listen carefully and caringly. We must be discerning and considerate. We do not want to bring a blowtorch into a conversation where a candle is needed. So how you engage the culture with the truth is you engage them in love. In love. So some on that. Now tactics, and I'll close. Look at tactics on page 20. Again, consider this is concerned with the concrete methods helpful for our purposes. And here I just want to point out, call out contradictions in this worldview. And there's so many more tactics I'd love to share, but let me just briefly close on this. Call out contradictions wherever you see them. Cry for consistency. Look at the next point, appeal to the conscience. In other words, be careful to, there's an ally in them. God put it there. It's their conscience. Appeal to that. If I had time, I would take you to Acts chapter 17 and show you how Paul did this. He speaks to a pagan culture, and though he talks about them being very religious, we couldn't do that in our culture because they wouldn't understand that category. They are religious, but they wouldn't understand. So what we would do is take the principle that we come to them and identify something of their devotion, something of their commitment, something of their worldview, and we connect with them on that level. Oh, I see this. Oh, I see that you are like this, that this is valuable to you. So we would connect there, but then ultimately we would then even maybe quote some of the things they say, because Paul quotes 2 of their poets. And then after that, what does he do? He doesn't linger there. He doesn't try to be chummy and buddy and say, hey, we're the same. Or no. The point is, I'm connecting with you, I'm relating to you, but I'm going to get to your conscience. And how he does it is he brings forward not code or law or just give them rules, but he puts forth Christ. And he says, every human being will be judged by this one. By this one. Christ is the standard that he will judge, and he's perfect. And so this is one of those things where you can appeal to the conscience of people, begin to ask them questions about their own integrity. On the next page, reason from Scripture because of the authority. It's always an issue of authority. So my next point is uncover functional authorities. They don't realize it, but you need to drive them to the place where you ask, and carefully, lovingly, kindly, but drive down below the surface and find out what is the functional authority in your life. What is the authority behind why you do what you do? Why you believe what you believe? Why you want what you want? What is the functional authority? You might not realize that it's there, but if you press it, you will find that's the functional authority. Yours, you should have you should be able to engage the culture and say, well, my functional authority is the Word of God. And therefore, because of that word, I can explain the whole world to you. I can explain life and death. I can explain origins and destinies. I can explain evil. I can explain good. I can explain hope. I can explain joy, pleasure. I can explain morality. I can explain all these things to you. I can explain sexuality, its purpose, its function, its joy, its delight, its sins. I can explain all that because of the authority I have. It's right here. How do you explain all this? So you have to get there to their functional authority and begin to help them see. Work with worldviews. I'll have to stop here, I know. But I have to tell you this. This is a burden on my heart. Oftentimes we get in this whole subject. When you are out there in the workplace, I know that it's hard because you just got a few minutes here and there sometimes. Or a friend or a family member. It's in the store. It's, at a family gathering. Holidays are coming up, right? Some of you are going to deal with this. And sometimes the opportunity just isn't there for you to get out the treatise and here are my 15 points. It just doesn't work. So what I'm after is this, though. Be careful and prepared in your mind to not allow yourself to be trapped in to an isolated debate. What I mean by that is in this whole scheme of things, don't stay in an isolated area as though it's this little area of sexuality or social justice or racism or any subpart of those, that somehow this is the whole deal. It's not the whole deal. And don't allow yourself to be just, whipped around in the conversation as though you're always on the defense. No, in whimsical love and gentleness, and it takes practice, and you're going to stumble, but in whimsical love and gentleness, you've got to take the reins of the conversation. Oftentimes, the best way to do that is through the power of questions. Not questions to hide behind, but questions to probe and expose. Like, so why do you believe that? Or what is the authority behind that? Where did you get that? Or did you know? So you do that and you take the reins of the conversation. And as you take the reins of the conversation, here's the key that I'm getting to. Don't allow the conversation to stay in an isolated focal point. Always come back and say, okay, I understand, and we could talk more about that, but let me ask you this. How does that relate to bingo? And you you keep the big picture in view, always. The only way we're going to properly engage the culture with the gospel of Christ in the midst of this raging chaos is to appeal to the conscience of these made in the image of God, these image bearers, and help them to see the connection of their worldview and how futile it is. They can't answer the hard questions, but they can argue and they can sometimes beat you in an isolated battle. But if you step back from that little isolated battle, like in a boxing ring, you don't want to get in that one corner, you get trapped there, you're done. If you step back from that and you bring them back to the bigger picture and keep coming back to the bigger issues and the connections of the issues and the authorities behind the beliefs and the ideologies, where they came from and where they're going, if you keep coming back to that, you'll find that you'll have greater ability to penetrate and get them to think. And that's what we want, right? So that by the grace of God, you might have opportunity to proclaim Christ. So don't be isolated in debate. Beloved and friends, it's been a joy to be able to share these things with you. It's been hard, sometimes painful for me to go through this material. But I've done this in a labor of love. As I said in the opening session, I'll close with this. I bring this to you not in a spirit of condemnation, but in a spirit of compassion for those entrapped in a godless and anti-Christian system. And I do this compelled by love for God, love for you, and a compassionate, caring love for this world. May we all seek to make much of Christ in that way. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the time we've had tonight. Thank you for your grace to us. I ask your mercy on each one. And I pray also that you would take truly a mass of information and thought and help us to assimilated in our minds, in the way we think, in the way we would be prepared to speak, and how we might give a defense for the hope that lies within us. I ask you, Father, that you would remind us of who we are in Christ, that you would humble us, each one and all together, and that, Lord, you would also stimulate us in our responsibility to do, to be, to act, to speak, as we are commissioned to. May we, as a local church, have a clear conscience in serving Christ in this world. May we do it for His glory, for the joy of your bride, and for the joy of all who would come. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.